Good morning, Professor.
Good morning.
So, I have so many thoughts going through my head right now. I mean, just like hundreds of thoughts about what's going on in society. But I'm hoping you're going to add some clarity, not just for me, but for anybody that may see this in the future. It seems like every single American thinks that every single thing that happens in the news cycle is a crisis, that they must have an opinion and they must be angry and they must hate other people and we must solve this yesterday. And by damn it, if we're gonna, we have to rally around me or our cause or our team, and the other team sucks. And this is really important. And I want to tell everybody about it now. And if you disagree, you're a jerk. And now maybe that's just my friends. Maybe your friends are all like in intellectual political science circles and you're all thoughtful and wise and you don't have emotions. Maybe it's just my friends that are like weird. And I'm talking student loans, I'm talking the January 6th committee, I'm talking what's going on in Ukraine. I mean, just like every imaginable issue. We hate what's going on and we have to fix it yesterday. And damn it, we're mad. Is this just my world or are there other people experiencing this?
It might be your world.
Okay, fair enough.
I mean, remember that if you're a Twitter user, you're one.
I'm not a Twitter user. Those people are nuts. Have you ever gone on Twitter?
Yeah, I mean, I have a Twitter account.
No, they're crazy. They like throw out crap and then people argue.
Yeah, there was a big controversy in the history profession last week, and everybody was in the process of describing how we were all losing our minds.
But, okay, so it's not just me then. It was a discussion.
Yeah, but also consider, Facebook users is down to about 24% of Americans now. TikTok is by far the most widely used social media platform.
Yeah, but aren't they just doing silly stuff on TikTok? They're not actually talking public policy, are they?
Yeah. Well, yes and no. You can buy influence on TikTok, and it's maybe the scariest of the social media platforms in terms of you can buy outrage on it.
Oh my God, you are making that up. I didn't know that. Really?
Yeah, you can buy influencers who will influence ideological messages. And some studies say it's as addictive as I don't know. I'm sure these are scare headlines, but the TikTok is as addictive as crack.
Right.
And so there are certainly a third to a half of Americans who are capable of being influenced by some form of social media.
Remind me, the TikTok thing is the Chinese thought experiment controlling America.
I mean, there are so many scary things about TikTok.
Right.
In some ways, the nefarious nature of how you can buy influence on it is the third scariest thing about TikTok. Is that it could destroy the political culture of the United States. That's the third scariest thing.
Okay. Do we want to know the first two, or should we go back to topic?
Well, I mean, I guess the first one is that it is the security threat it represents to the actual national security of the United States because of the access that the Chinese government has towards.
Right, and that's just by like any tiny little thing you reveal may make you vulnerable to bribing, or like, hey, do you want to release that you've done this? And I mean, every single American is now like a security threat, right?
But also capable of detecting things like troop movements and
yeah.
I mean,
because you're talking to your loved one who's a soldier, and I mean, just all sorts of stuff is horrible in that. Yeah,
the biggest problem the Chinese probably have with it is how to aggregate and make all that data useful.
Right. Well, yeah, but they can do that. I mean, that's not that hard.
It's harder than you think. I mean, we throw an awful lot of brain power and computing power behind the coming up with artificial intelligence mechanisms for getting the data and making it useful.
But Professor Bill Shepard signed on, and he's
you cut out, so now I'm just assuming that you're insulting Bill Shepard and talking about how we are.
I have no idea what he's saying about me right
yeah,
now.
who knows? But I think he's saying that Bill Shepard doesn't use TikTok.
I do not.
Yeah,
Right. And he doesn't want to even answer my Facebook polls either. But I'm sorry I missed a couple minutes.
Hey, I do too.
You do not. Okay. So, Professor, I got to get us on topic because we're already 6 minutes in. Crisis in America. It seems like we've lost perspective. There are really important things. And maybe it's debt and deficit. Maybe it's Ukraine. Maybe it's still race relations. Maybe it's climate change. It could be, I mean, there's just a lot. I mean, maybe it's educational ability of people not to make sound decisions. I mean, there is like a bazillion things across the political spectrum that could be a crisis in America. Agreed or no? Like, is everything hunky dory? Are we all just good?
No, we're a churning mess of hundreds of millions of Americans all just trying to make it through another day.
Yeah, doing weird stuff, and some of it's good and some of it's weird and others bad, and right. But there potentially is some real crisis, right?
Yeah, I always try to moderate my belief in crisis by reminding myself that every day we manage to live with 30 million Americans who don't think that the moon landing took place.
Yeah, and apparently 30 million, fine. Apparently over 50% of Americans believe in at least one conspiracy or more.
Yeah, and most 2/3 of Americans can't name the 3 branches of government.
Yikes. So does that mean we hate Americans? We just gave 3 examples right in a row without even thinking. Do we think Americans are dumb? Do we think Americans aren't worthy of self-determination and representative democracy? I mean, are we insulting our colleagues and friends and family members?
No, because we still have in the United States a political culture of justice, and fairness that manages to seep its way into most events where if Americans are presented with a story of injustice, that we will still recognize it as injustice. And so I'd say that's still a good sign if you're looking for good signs in American culture.
Well, but you still didn't answer my question. Did we just insult our fellow colleagues and Americans? Or
But most people don't care about this stuff because they don't have to. And that's probably fine.
Okay. Yeah, because they're living their life.
Yes.
And they don't care what a professor thinks and what I think about. They don't care.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Fair enough. So follow me on this little thought experiment. So I just gave you like 5 things that are currently going on in America: climate change, racial strife, debt and deficit. Insurrection. Whether we have I mean, that's 4. And there may be like another 5 things or 10 things. There could be 50 things. Student debt repayment. Everybody's angry at that one way or the other. There are a lot of things that are in crisis. How about you? You're again, remind if this is the first show that somebody signs up in, what are your bona fides? What are your credentials?
Oh, I don't know. I'm a history.
Come on.
I have a PhD. I write about history and politics, and I talk about history and politics a lot. Yeah,
but an undergraduate, a master's degree, a PhD, a full-time professor. PhD. Yeah, I mean, this is what you do. You're a U.S. history professor.
Yes, I am.
So I gave you 5 to 6 different current potential crises. I've got my 5 or 6 or 10 throughout history crises in America. Mm-hmm. What are your big ones? I mean, if we want to compare our current crises to U.S. history, I've been alive 56 years. You've been alive a little younger. We've been around 240 something or 48 or something. I can't quite remember, but we've been around a while. What are the big crises in America for us to compare our current crises to? I mean, the pandemic, gosh, I skipped the pandemic. That was a big crisis. So is the 1918 Spanish flu one of them? Or what are your big 3, 4, 5, 6? Just talk for a few minutes.
The big 3 are always the Revolutionary War, the Civil War, and World War II.
All right, so you've taught me well. I've got all 3 of those on my list. So talk for a second about the Revolutionary War. Compared to today's animosity towards each other, and how we live our lives, just give a little bit of perspective of citizens, not even citizens, just people in the U.S. during the Revolutionary War times.
Well, I guess I would just say we're creating an ideological nation state. So that means that we are creating a nation of people who have shared ideas. And one of and you have to be committed enough to those ideas to be willing to lose everything, your property, your home, your family, and all of that. But also think about that when the war was over, tens and hundreds of thousands of people left because they didn't want to live in the United States. And so in terms of a crisis, I would just say, imagine a crisis so large where you would be willing to give up your life, your everything that you own, everything you hold dear, and you would be willing to leave the country one way or the other, depending on how it was determined, and then also how astounding it is to create a new order for the ages, for all of human history. So it's really hard to underestimate the effect that the American Revolution had, not just in the United States, but on the trajectory of the world.
Okay, so that was a true crisis that changed humanity, not just America, but changed the world structure. The Revolutionary War in America. What is a book or two we should all read about that?
Oh, I just say like pick up anything by Gordon Wood,
Okay.
Or Edmund Morgan. Just go on Amazon and type in Gordon Wood or Edmund Morgan, and you're going to get something good that's worth reading. That will.
So those are two preeminent historians that are worthy of reading if you understand a true crisis.
But also the kind of historians who would write a book that was comprehensive enough that if you want to read, they've got Gordon Wood has a book that's 1,000 pages, and he's got a book that's about 120 pages. So by all means, if you want to read a nice 120-page book on the American Revolution, Gordon Wood's your guy.
Good. I'm glad I asked because I don't think I've read anything from Gordon Wood, so I'm glad I asked. Okay, so Revolutionary War. Let's study that in comparison to compare today. Got it. Now we're up to the
Civil War. Yeah, and this, as Abraham Lincoln explained to us, the Civil War justified the work of the founders, which is to say it said whether or not what the founders had done was worth doing, because it was testing what Hamilton said in Federalist One, whether or not human beings could govern themselves from reflection and choice. Because the alternative explanation that is pretty appealing is to have a society organized around racism, which is what the rebels were proposing, to have a society that looks exactly like the United States, but instead founded on racism. So Lincoln did a pretty good job of explaining this to the American people, in several famous speeches, but testing whether a nation so conceived could actually continue to function. Can we govern ourselves? Can we have a government based on liberty rather than racism or accident, or what Hamilton would call accident and force?
Conceived in liberty shall not perish from this earth. Yeah, you've actually started to teach me some stuff. Okay, fine. But why do we use words today that seem to be as melodramatic as a couple 100,000 people losing their lives in the Revolutionary War? Why are we vitriolic enough in significant issues? The George Floyd thing and the Ahmaud, I mean, those things really bothered me. So I'm upset about them. But why do we go to the deep end of all of a sudden now where we should be in a civil war over this stuff?
Well, I mean, I guess if we want to be as generous as possible, maybe.
Yeah, that's a good way to live life. Good.
I can use a health metaphor, which is to say that if you believe that what somebody else believes in is a cancer that will eventually kill them, you're going to react strongly. So, you know, I never smoked in my life, but you know, if I knew that smoking cigarettes was going to lead to somebody getting cancer, I would object to them smoking, even though that one cigarette is not what's going to kill them. And so a lot of people, I think, when projecting a sense of crisis, they see a small thing and project out the terrible consequence that they believe will come about.
You're not just being generous. You're saying it's a legitimate fear, or I mean, it's a legitimate argument. It may not be the total right argument, but it's still a legitimate point that
Sure.
that if they feel like they're driving while black and they could get killed by a police officer because they see instances about it and they've been pulled over, probably more than their white friends, they are really, really angry, and the Civil War is still being fought today.
Yeah.
And I know I'm trying to summarize a lot in just a minute or so, but it's legitimate.
Well, hold on. Saying that
Cool.
it's like therapists say, all feelings are real, but the job of a good therapist is to reconcile your feelings with reality, which is to say, if you begin dwelling on these things in a way, you are engaging in a behavior that is psychologically unhealthy, because you're not putting this crisis into a context that is mentally or emotionally healthy for an adult.
You're saying it's really complex. In the Civil War was a real crisis. Today in race relations likely is not, although there's instances of really important things, but we're not in where we were in the Civil War.
But I just want you, but I want to get back to this like feeling of crisis though, because I have two things on my desk actually right now randomly that sort of illustrate my point, which is in the old days, you would get a newspaper.
Yeah.
In that newspaper, you would see that there was a story here about Biden loan relief fuels debate about inflation. But you would also see a story about China and delisting and Peloton reporting losses. In other words, you would be receiving this news in context with a bunch of other news. And that would allow you to have some perspective that all of this stuff is happening in the world simultaneously, rather than here's another tweet about student loans. Here's another one. Here's another one. Here's another one. Here's another hit off the outrage machine that's going to, you know, the emotionally and psychologically healthy way to absorb news is to remind yourself that all of this stuff is happening in a context. And then another book that I just happen to be propping up my computer on is The Coddling of the American Mind. And in it, in the index, I can actually pull because the computer is literally sitting on this book.
Yeah.
So
much for our production values.
Yeah, so much for production value. You know, he's somebody who benefited from cognitive behavioral therapy, and he goes through the categories of distorted automatic thoughts and mind reading, fortune telling, catastrophizing, labeling, discounting positives, negative filtering, overgeneralizing, dichotomous thinking, shoulds, personalizing, blaming, unfair comparison, regret orientation, what ifs, emotional reasoning, inability to disconfirm, and judgment focus. And when somebody tells me that they won't be your friend anymore because of your position on student loan relief, I would say they are expressing distorted automatic thoughts that lead to human unhappiness. And it's not, there's no logical or historical, there's nothing a historian can do to fix that. It's something that a therapist is supposed to fix, not a historian.
Fascinating. But that's the whole point of today's show, is I'm hoping that we can take some scenarios throughout history, and not ancient history, not where we don't have knowledge. I mean, talking about the last 200 years of history where we have a lot of knowledge, and go, yeah, it may be bad and you may be irritated and you're frustrated and you're pissed and you're going to vote. And all those are actually okay. And especially voting, I think that's actually a good thing. But the hatred across the spectrum going on right now, I just don't get in comparison to our next topic, World War II. So that was a real crisis, right?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, and a crisis that was happening, simultaneously with some other, I would say, the long-term crisis of modernity. But in the midst of this long-term crisis of the modern condition, you have someone in the world who's demonstrating how dynamic evil could be when taking advantage of the tools of modernity. And that has proven to be the deadliest crisis creating force in human history. So you have somebody like Hitler who believes that arranging the world along a racial hierarchy it is a positive good, and is willing to enact that in a ruthless way. And it led to a crisis in the world.
Okay, but Professor, we didn't declare war on that. We declared war on Japan.
And Germany, yeah.
Well, but we weren't like ready to go to war against what you're just talking about. We were in a throes of a debate, weren't we?
Yes and no. In a sense, it became clear pretty quickly that the war itself was about what kind of world would exist after the war was over. In other words, we've used this example a lot in previous shows, but do we handle the heart attack or the cancer first? And the Germany and Japan, that was a heart attack.
Well, okay, but I guess humor me for just a second, because I actually do want to learn from you. The Japan bombing of Pearl Harbor was in the throes of the heart attack. Nazi Germany was going to be a heart attack, maybe, but it wasn't the heart attack. We didn't.
Well, we were still planning. I mean, sort of.
Yeah. So educate me. No, educate
me. Here's some actual history stuff.
Right.
The joke was always that yes, there was a conspiracy to get us in World War II, but FDR wanted to get us in the World War II against the Germans, not the Japanese, and we were trying to orchestrate an event in the North Atlantic that would lead us to war with Germany. And so it's hard to imagine a scenario where we weren't at war with Germany in 1942. Because the attack on Pearl Harbor was so devastating, it meant that our focus almost had to be on the world. But because we were so far away from Europe and Japan, it was going to be a while before we could find a way to kind of get in the war, to put ourselves on a full war footing. But
you're making my point. That's just a pretext to get in the war. It wasn't over a philosophical battle of freedom versus authoritarian genocide. I mean,
but it really, well, you're right, because we didn't know that genocide was taking place.
Right.
But it was, even setting aside, it wasn't a war on racism per se, but it was, will the world be a place where the United States can continue to exist? It's almost impossible to imagine how the United States could have maintained its sovereignty and its place in the world if the rest of the world falls under the sway of these two totalitarian regimes. So and they did have plans for what they were going to do with the United States. So staying out of it was really not an option. And FDR did a pretty good job once the war started of at least creating it had to almost be a pretext, because, the Soviet Union had to be part of the mix. But FDR did a pretty good job of outlining what were called the four freedoms, so that saying that this is what at least the United States and Britain and maybe the Soviets are for, and thus giving people something constructive to fight for, even before the horrors of the Holocaust were known, because we really understand that stuff till
Yeah,
after.
not yet. Yeah, we didn't understand yet how bad it was. Let me switch gears to a couple others that you haven't mentioned. You mentioned three big ones, and I concur: Revolutionary War, Civil War, World War II. The Depression. I mean, wasn't that a crisis? The Spanish flu, 1918/Depression/World War I. I mean, there was a pretty tough time there. If we were born in that, if that was the maturity of our lives from say 15 to 40 or something, yikes, that was a tough part of world history in America, wasn't it?
Well, you know, I hate to downplay any crisis, but I always kind of work from big to small. If you imagine that the incentivization of peace under the system that arose between Britain and the United States it is the best thing that ever happened in human history, then I always kind of define a crisis as what are the biggest threats to that. So that's why I can kind of prioritize those three events so easily. You know, very few, you get very little debate about those three. But I would say that anything that threatens the incentivization of peace between human beings is certainly a crisis.
So you really don't have much to talk about the Spanish flu, the Depression, the First World War. I mean, is there anything to mention in brevity?
Yeah, I mean, I would say my old advisor, Alonzo Hamby, wrote a book on what he thought FDR's greatest contribution was for the survival of democracy. So, because when Franklin Roosevelt became president, there was such a deep economic crisis in the United States that a dictator could have taken over if FDR had wanted to be a dictator. And so the fact that FDR's heroes were American political figures, and decent ones, meant that.
And you're talking Washington and Lincoln and Jefferson and.
Yeah. But well, he was more of a Jefferson, Jackson, Wilson kind of a guy. But right. But because his heroes were all people within the American political tradition, it meant that for him, turning the United States into a dictatorship would be a failure, not a success.
Right. So, and is there, should we read his book, Alonzo Hansby's, or is there another one that you'd recommend?
I mean, on that specific point, that is the best book. It's called For the Survival of Democracy, and it's by Alonzo Hamby, Hamby. Yeah.
A hard read, or do you have to be a political scientist or a historian?
I don't think it's a hard read. It's one of his, I think it's one of his easier books to read.
For the Survival of American Democracy, was that it, did you say?
For the Survival of Democracy, yeah.
Democracy.
Yeah, Liberalism and Its Challengers was kind of his other easy to read book. If you wanted to read a book about FDR to Bush, but if you really want a hard read, but that will change your life, his masterpiece is really Man of the People, which is a full biography of Harry Truman. And when I say full biography, it covers every aspect of Harry Truman's life. So if you really want to understand, and it ends up being, Man of the People ends up being this really great lens to understand what America was like, because for most of Harry Truman's life, he was a pretty normal American. He just has this, then he becomes a senator and then he becomes a president. But if you really study the life of Harry Truman before he was in public office, it becomes this great insight into what American life was like for somebody of the lower middle class in the late 19th, early 20th century. You get a great insight of what life's like in the Midwest at that time.
Cool. Yeah. Professor, I know 4 people that love America. Sounds trite, but you know, that feeling, that like America, that appreciate America, that want to contribute to America, that, you know, I know 4 of them, and that also have some great concerns about where we are. There's like some crises. I mean, in our real friends' lives, not some weird internet poster or some crazy person invading the Capitol or saying hang Fauci. I mean, you know, there's a bunch of weird people out there. No, but these are real people in our lives that we know. So we have concerns. Those 4 people are all on this video call right now. They're Professor Stephen Tootle, Bill Shepard, Bart Miller, me. And we know a ton of other people. It just so happens that I know each of you pretty well now. So do we skip the assassinations of the 60s? You know, JFK and Martin Luther King, Reverend, do we, I mean, is that a real crisis, or the drug revolution, or the sexual revolution, or Roe v. Wade, and now overturn? I mean, what are the current crises of the last Vietnam War, for God's sakes? I mean, there's been a lot of crises, Iraq War. Like there's hundreds of crises in the couple hundred years of drought in America. I mean, you can just go on and on and on and on. Where are we? Use your professorial lens and give some guidance to Bart and Bill and I on how to be effective in our citizenship. I mean, should we be angry and mad and protesting out in the street, or should we be doing something different?
I would just remind you that I mentioned the crisis of modernity, but the real crisis of modernity in many ways is human beings coming to understand that they could not understand the world. And you have to come to some sort of peace about that, because you can't drink from a fire hose. You know, you point a fire hose at your face and turn it on full blast and see what happens. That is what information is. And thus, there is no way for a human being to absorb all of that. It's too much. So I think one of the things that we all have to do is find some way of prioritizing how we and be deliberate about how we prioritize information. And I say one of the thing that we really lost in the age of micro-targeting of advertisements is we lost editors because we don't. You think about what it means that we used to have broadcasters, meaning that when mass media was invented, it was broadcast. It was cast out there broadly, and you never had any idea who was listening or why. And so the messaging was targeted at the middle of everyone, and maybe even a little bit better than the middle of everyone, in the sense that you thought that what you were doing was supposed to be aspirational and maybe even educational. And maybe,
so they're better angels of everyone. Right. Yeah.
But in today's media environment, all media comes to us now in and it is narrowcast, meaning it is designed to take whatever negative feelings you have and amplify those, because your negative feelings are the most powerful feelings you have. And it will keep your negative feelings will keep you the most engaged. And if you absorb your information without thinking about how you absorb your information, this is how your information will come to you. It will always come to you in a way designed to make you feel angry and have that anger targeted at real targets, because that will keep you engaged.
So, Professor, now that we're reposting these on Spotify, I'm envisioning the recipient of the broadcast. Someone happens to find this Spotify discussion on Spotify. They just run into it and they're listening to it.
We've got to change the name, by the way. We have the world's worst name. Toodle Talk is so
I
stupid.
love Toodle Talks. I think that is completely hilarious.
I suggested that it was Toodle Talk and Brack Attack, and I suggested that as a joke.
I remember.
I never thought that you would actually say, "Oh, well, I'm going to drop the part that makes it clearly a joke." And
the Brack Attack, yeah, but I like Toodle Talks. You've got some credentials. So if somebody runs into this show, back on point. Sorry, if someone runs into this show, all of a sudden they're going to have this aha moment, and they'll go, "You know what? You're right. For the last 10 or 15 years since social media has come up, I just get really angry when I see something that's opposed to my core values or belief systems, and I just vent out." I mean, the Archie Bunker of my generation, you just yell at the TV set, and then when Meathead comes in the room, you yell at Meathead. And that's what everybody in America seems to be doing now. But also our conversation today is going to give them this aha moment. Whoa, wait, there really were crises in America where we rallied behind things, and this ain't it. The last crisis of the day, Hunter Biden's laptop, or Mar-a-Lago and the FBI going into Mar-a-Lago, or you just take hundreds of different things where we just throw everything at the wall that we hate the other side now. Wait, do we really? Or were there some things throughout, not too long ago, where there are real issues that we should be pause and be more reflective and be more mature and be more resolved to fixing the damn thing. And so tell me some historical perspective that might just give a little bit of flypaper, just give them a little bit of stickiness. Okay, I'll read a book, or let me think about it in a different way. And I'm not trying to convince people that don't want to be convinced. I get it. I'm just trying to provide some value to the world that should somebody happen to run into it, maybe we can help them. What are your reflections?
But I'm constantly reminded, nobody cares what I think. You can't convince anybody of anything ever. All you can do is.
So you liked my column on the abortion issue in the Denver Post?
Yeah, I did, and
no one cares what I think.
Right?
They don't care.
But if there's some part of me, answering a question that can somehow draw out the better angels of someone's nature, then I feel like I have some sort of responsibility to put that content out there. But I also want to make sure that I'm not diminishing the real things that are happening in people's lives, because I want to make sure that anybody doesn't walk away from this with me thinking that when you encounter something that is an outrage, but I would say make sure it's a real outrage and that it's really happening, and especially there are real outrages that are probably taking place within 1 mile of where you live, and there are things that you've probably seen and experienced, in your job, in your church, in your schools, in your local government, because you're surrounded by human beings who are not without guile. And so I think that in a way, one of the things that is harmful about focusing so much on the symbolic actions that take place far away is it blinds you to how you should be vetting all of your candidates for local office. To me, the debate about student loans, just to take the thing that's ripped from the headlines, I find it strange that how often, because so many people who are taking part in the debates were either Obama partisans or Trump partisans, that nobody is sitting around saying he shouldn't have been able to do this because he doesn't have the legal authority to do it. Now, why aren't the Obama people doing that? Because Obama did this. And why aren't the Trump people doing it? Because Trump did it. And what's left entirely out of this debate is, how do we feel about presidents just ruling like dictators when they and claiming authority? I mean, to do this as part of to be justified as part of pandemic crisis legislation, it is pretty laughable and weird. I mean, especially if you, like, I would say, if it was intended as a needs-based, targeted help, it should have just gone to poor people. But then Biden lifted the caps because he said, well, it should go to teachers and married couples. And I thought to myself, well, those are all people who continue to get paychecks through the pandemic. So it is therefore not crisis from the pandemic legislation. That sort of undermines, I would think, the argument that this was something that was motivated by the pandemic. So whether or not is a good idea, to me, is kind of a third or fourth order. That's something that it would be wonderful to have congressmen debating this, and President Biden signing legislation, but
but we've gotten away from that. And your point was, former President Trump did it with the wall.
Yep.
And former President Obama did it. Remind me, I'm sure I know, but
he did it a few times. But he did it with DACA, and he also did
DACA.
it with Trump to appoint Elizabeth Warren as a So
yeah, he did it with DACA, no doubt. So whether you like the issue or not,
I would have supported it. I supported DACA legislation. I just don't support a president waving his magic wand. Because Obama had a magic wand and Trump had a magic wand, and now Joe Biden has a magic wand. And what I don't like is that in all of the debates that I'm hearing, nobody is standing up for the idea that Congress is supposed to legislate. The first article of the Constitution is that all legislative authority lies in the Congress. It seems pretty plainly written. I don't know why we keep debating it.
Yeah. So, Professor, we have gone way over time, and I do want to hear from Bill and Bart if they're so inclined. But given your three big ones, and I gave you over the whole course of the conversation almost a dozen different things we should, our crisis in America. And you gave me three big ones: the Revolutionary War, Civil War, World War II, and we talked about some stuff that are kind of in between. Where are you right now? My last question is, where are you right now? Are you excited about America?
Oh, I thought
are you optimistic? Or can we get through this? Or no, are there enough people that are angry that we should all be worried about our future success as a constitutional republic? Or where are you? Are you optimistic, pessimist, somewhere in between? Where are we in crisis? Because that's the big crisis that a lot of people are talking about. We're a republic if we can keep it.
I am optimistic about the potential of the American people always, because especially teaching college, you really come into contact with really good human beings who are thoughtful and kind and considerate. And
you're talking about your students.
My students, yeah.
Yeah.
So, it should certainly, if you had a job like mine, you would probably be less cynical. But at the same time, I am extremely concerned about elite institutions in America. And I am wildly concerned about media institutions and institutions of learning, both higher learning and K-12 education.
And political parties and major nonprofits, or no? I mean,
Well, I guess I would say my concern, my other long-term concern when it comes to the federal government is the growth of the administrative state, so much so that we just turn to it in all cases. And it is an incredibly dynamic force, but it's permanent. And the side effect of the administrative state, just the growth of government. Let's imagine that our government was great, and that
you're not talking the local sidewalk government and the local sewer government. You're talking state and / federal government.
Yeah, I would say state and federal, because
okay.
State governments are often like this too. California is certainly a big enough state government to be like this. But I always say, like, imagine if the government was actually working and it was doing everything it was supposed to do. One of the things that happens when you have so many things determined by the administrative state is it just creates a series of incentives in your life. And you would almost be foolish not to take them. But you end up altering the course of your own life because of the incentives of the administrative state. I mean, one of the things that I would say, I always proclaim that I'm bad with money, right? But I consider being bad with money an outgrowth of my desire to live a free life, which means that when I'm making a decision about what I want to do.
How many motorcycles do you have, Professor?
5. Yeah. When I'm making a decision about what I want to do, I do not consider the tax implications of my actions. Now, you could say that that's a mistake. I mean, everybody who cares about money would say that that's a mistake. But I just want to retain my ability to make decisions for myself without considering the incentives that the government has for me. So, when I was figuring the cost of solar for my house, yeah, I know there's a tax credit out there, but I'm figuring it out without the tax credit. And then if there is one, fine, I'll take it. But I do these things deliberately because I do not want the incentives of the administrative state determining how I live my life. And the same goes for my retirement. People say, oh, you're foolish. You don't know what your retirement's going to be. Right, because I don't want to live my life that way. And you can call me foolish, but I in each of these things, you think about, like, I know people who will not earn a certain amount of money in order to stay within a specific tax bracket. In California, you can send your kids to any of the UCs for free if you make, I think, less than $85,000 a year. And if you consider what you would be paying if you made $120,000 a year, you have a lot of incentive for the couple of years before your kids go into school. Find some way of making under 85 grand, and your kids would all go to school for free. And I would just say, I don't want to live my life that way. And so I don't, now, when you throw in the fact that the government is also not always good, and that some of their ideas are actually bad, I would say both of these things combined kind of should give us pause about just the size and scope of the federal government.
Do you think, on that point alone, then we got to open it up to Bill and Bart.
Let me say one more thing.
Please.
One thing I have to get in there. The other reason is that it robs the federal government of the resources it needs in order to cope with the other aspect of modernity, which is giant corporations and rich people. The more money that we are spending on, things that we think of as good ideas or bad ideas or whatever, altering people's lives, we're not spending money protecting the rights of all Americans, and we're not spending money making sure that rich people don't have too much influence in our political system. And you will run out of dollars. And it just is to me, a fact of the administrative state. Sorry.
Yeah, no, so you're optimistic and concerned in a variety of systemic ways.
Yeah, well, think of it like the health of yourself, right? Every day, I mean, I went swimming. That's a good thing, right? But I also I ate some pudding,
Welcome to my world.
Yeah, like, because I was like, oh, I want a snack, every day you get up and you try again.
Is the best way to get healthier, lose weight, or be a better nation to rally around one team and beat the other team up? That's where we're still currently in, but there must be periods throughout US history that we've had some pauses in that animosity against the other Americans. No? Or we always hate each other?
I would say the best thing to do would be to create an identity for yourself around seeking truth rather than any particular loyalty, so that when somebody says something, I mean, this is the hardest thing for a human being to do, but when somebody says something and you're proven wrong, to say, okay, you're right, I'm wrong, and I will never say that other thing again. And if you create your identity around the idea that that's who you are, you're the guy who, when facts come around, you change your mind. I would say is a much healthier.
But can Americans do that, or have we always been weird, emotional people?
Well, everybody's weird and emotional, but
well, I know that.
You never get to escape that, but
right.
You don't get to escape your humanity and that's a good thing and it's a bad thing.
Okay.
I mean, that was great genius, is to understand that the same human brain is capable of the greatest things that have ever been achieved, but also the worst things. And it's not different people. It's not that one guy's good and one guy's bad. It's the same. It's often the same person.
Yeah. Well, okay, you're going to end with that, but you have lots of time to answer some questions of Bart and Bill. You have 10 minutes. You can take 5 minutes apiece, or you can split it, or we can have a four-way conversation. I'm going to try to remain silent for the next 10 minutes, except for facilitating. Bart or Bill, who's up?
Bill, why don't you go ahead?
Bart, Bart, you open your mouth, you're up.
Yep. Yeah, okay. I'm really glad the professor said what he said right at the end there. Because I have to admit, during a lot of my adult life, I didn't really believe or feel that I had to do that. What you were talking about. I felt as though I could kind of depend on other people to do that, at least in terms of politics and government, because I was not, I'm not going to be the president. I'm not going to be the governor or something like that. So there's somebody else who's more important to me that can handle all that. But what I realized in the last 2 or 3 years is, I really need to take an interest in this stuff and formulate a position based on what I learned. And it's got to be rational. And whether other people agree with me or disagree with me is not very important to me, because I realize I'm, like you were saying, Professor, earlier, it's like no one cares what you think. Well, no one really cares what I think either. We get right down to it. But I care what I think. And I care when other people ask me what I think, and I don't have an intelligent answer for them. And I would rather have an intelligent answer for them. And the only way I can do that is if I kind of learn a bunch of stuff. Because otherwise I can't be a contributing citizen, I guess, of our country.
Yeah, and that's such an important point. That's why I've emphasized at several points of reading of books, because when somebody comes along who sounds like they know what they're talking about, they will often espouse a position that if you know one or two things about history, that's not right. I can't tell you how many times I've been in a meeting with somebody where they say, we need to do this because of this. And I'll say, why is that exactly? And they'll say, well, you're a historian, that, and I'll never forget, like, one of these stupid examples, but in our faculty hiring manual, we had this thing about the history of racism and imperialism and stuff, and it was mentioning all this stuff about Hawaii, and I was like, Hawaii was a foreign country during this period. It wasn't part of America. And I, that's, you would think somebody would catch that, you know, but no, it's part of the sort of hiring guidelines for all of the largest system of higher education in the United States. And
the world, actually.
Yeah, well, it's third in the world.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, third in the world, largest in the United States, because there's China has a system and India has a system. Yeah, yeah, they just sort of, oh, none of this is true, but we're just going to do it anyway. And if anybody in that room knew anything about just kind of the basics of, I would consider, American or world history, somebody would have stuck their hand up and said, well, none of this is actually true. Does that matter to anyone in this room? So I don't know, pick up a book. The other reason why I like books, let me just make a pitch for books again, is that books grant you empathy. You inhabit the mind of the author, and in many cases, the characters. And that alone, especially, I would say, pitch for history, right? That when you begin learning about multiple perspectives and complexity in the past, it reminds you of the multiple perspectives and complexity in the present. You will cease to see the people of the past as one-dimensional caricatures, and thus it actually, a well-written history book, I think, really does grant you empathy and perspective that is useful in everyday life.
So Bart, I have no idea how you sussed that out of the professor, but it went to one of my hidden agendas, which isn't hidden. I've mentioned it twice now. Professor, this is almost our 50th show. I've never added it up, and neither have you, but we're somewhere around 50. What a great, we could take each 50 shows and you eliminate 20 of them and you get 30 chapters of your book of what you just said, history and how it applies to contemporary, and to give some wisdom. And so anyway, Bart, good job. Maybe you can be the editor for Professor Tootle in his book on American history and compared to contemporary politics.
I'll just let Bart, how about this, Bart? You write it and I'll give you co-writing. We'll just share the.
All right, and Bill, you can be the editor. I don't care, but I think America needs this kind of wisdom instead of just reacting to the tweet or the angry politician, and then we all rally around that politician. We're in a mess right now. It's not that hard to fix. I think your answer is right. We need a book. Thank you, Bart and Professor. Bill, you're up.
All right. Oh, there's so many threads I want to pull on from this. This is fascinating. One has to do with the administrative state, but Professor Tootle, I'd like to see you guys do a whole session on the administrative state, especially at the federal level. I think that would be fascinating. But what I want to zero in on, you kind of set the stage with this statistic that 20 million people in America still don't believe we landed on the moon. I think the research or the polls suggest that
could be 30 or 32 million.
Yeah, or 30 million. I think the polls suggest that 20 million people today in the United States believe violence is justified in the defense of our American ideals.
I think it's more than that, Bill, isn't it? I'll make sure you check that later, but I think it's greater.
It might be. I heard 20 million. But here's what I'm fascinated by, and as you point out, Stephen, I mean, it's we got to keep 20 million. We got to keep that in perspective. It's a relatively small number, but this idea of broadcasting versus narrowcasting has the potential. When you add in the mix of politicians deciding to amplify those feelings of fear and anger and violence. And their narrowcasting, if they were broadcasting, I don't think they would say those things, because they would offend more people than they would rally to their cause. But now we have politicians who are incented to speak to their base. Somehow it seems like the message riles their base but fails to offend others. I don't know. I just find this to be really complex and worrisome, because now you can take people who might otherwise distance themselves from this rhetoric and join in that anger and, be more willing to take violent action.
Yes. And, and it's, let me make you even more depressed. Or
Thank you.
Or point back to something else we were discussing. It is the growth of the administrative state that has also created that as conditions for politicians. Because really the reason that you see this from politicians is because of how hard it is to get nationwide ballot access for anybody outside the two-party system. So it is the growth of the administrative state, the legislative and legal requirements of what it takes to run for office. It is something that means that all of this narrow casting is now getting filtered into something that must go into this two-party system that has shrunk, and a very small number of people are determining who gets to be on the ballot. And sure, we could, as the argument would be, well, run yourself, or elect better human beings. And that is part of the challenge of the American people. But it is just very difficult, as somebody who is somewhat involved still in local races, even nonpartisan races, races where you're not supposed to declare any kind of party affiliation. The person who declares some kind of party affiliation comes in with a huge advantage, because of the requirements of the administrative state. And that's why I think my hope is that at some point the Supreme Court will undo, or I should say, everybody hates Citizens United because they, it undid, corporate free speech. But my problem with Citizens United is that it didn't go far enough. It left political speech as the only restricted form of speech, which is, I think, one of the things that has contributed to
Only political speech is restricted. That didn't resonate with me. Say that again where I can understand it.
Well, Citizens United, the Supreme Court decided it on the basis of, well, who are we to decide which of these corporate entities is a news organization? So,
right.
CNN is a corporation, and so is the New York Times, and this cable outfit that is broadcasting a thing. And it essentially means that if Jeff Bezos wants to buy the Washington Post, he can. But that also means that Exxon can give money to this thing called a political action committee that engages in political speech. But it left in place the restrictions on giving money to political parties.
Okay, from that angle, I understand your point.
Yeah.
Okay, cool.
So the only types of restrictions are on, and that's another thing, by the way, that has contributed to a more poisonous political environment.
No doubt, no doubt.
So
in some ways, we're left with kind of the worst of both worlds. We have the regulations in place that require us to use political parties, while political parties have now become so wildly weak that Republicans haven't been able, Republicans don't stand for Republican ideals, and the Democratic Party hasn't stood for Democratic ideals. And instead you have political action committees and individual candidates who, if they can find a very narrow group of citizens, then political action dollars will flow to them as individuals. but it's still being filtered through the
Either through very wealthy people, big unions, or big trade associations. I mean, there's a variety of ways to gather money and power, but it's not the political parties. Yeah.
yeah, we've thrown some babies out with some bathwater.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. So that's not a crisis, though, is it?
Well, I would say it is leading to a political crisis insofar as it. Other than, you know, I will say this for President Biden, he is effectively legislating, which is another thing that makes the student loan thing so disappointing, is that he set that aside and you'd say he's had one of the most effective legislative sessions of a president, far more effective than Obama or Trump.
Right.
Yeah, with the same majorities. So
Just a couple of years. Yeah. A bunch of stuff. And man, I don't know how we're going to afford it, but a bunch of stuff.
yeah, again, not my priorities, but
Right.
just in terms of, is this person achieving legislative priorities by passing laws?
Yeah.
You would have to say yes.
Yeah. Bill, you have 1 minute to do a follow-up question, and Professor, only 1 minute in response, and then we're done for today.
Okay, follow-up question. Now I'm losing my thread.
Welcome to our world.
It was brilliant, though.
I'm sure.
Administrative state.
No. Oh, I know what it was. Okay, so from a historical perspective, if we go back to, I'll just pick McCarthyism and that whole thing. What didn't exist then in terms, I don't care if it's administrative state or maybe it was lack of narrow casting technology at the time. I mean, did that make it, what were the elements that made it easier to defeat McCarthy? You know, there was that famous, comment about, sir, if you have, do you have no shame?
Excellent question. The first thing is Dwight Eisenhower. And if you want to read an account of this, there's a great book called The Hidden Hand Presidency, but that describes many elements of Eisenhower's presidency where he was working behind the scenes to achieve these goals. But it was Dwight Eisenhower who really orchestrated the takedown of Joseph McCarthy. So here's what we had at the time. We had political leadership that was actually focused on what was best for the United States over the long term. So not achieving some sort of short-term political gain by continuing to perpetuate McCarthyism. So our elite institutions. Next, you had elite political journalists who were broadly influential in shaping public opinion. And you can even read, you'd be the second person in the world to read my dissertation, which was on elite political journalists during that time.
Wow, this has finally come up after almost 50 shows. Hooray, good job, Bill.
Finally, my dissertation is momentarily useful. And then you had the sort of lower level media institutions and educational institutions that were more focused on individual liberty and the values of classical liberalism, resisting all of this. Because I always tell my students, it's not that evil doesn't take place in a pluralistic society. It's that if you have a society dedicated to pluralistic ideas, what it does is it limits them. In other places, if you get a McCarthy, you get massacres, and you don't get. I mean, I don't mean to diminish it, but some people lost their jobs or had to change their names on. It wasn't that bad. And in terms of the effect on people's real lives, what we're living through now is far worse than what happened during McCarthyism. But probably a subject for another day. But you're right. We had all these institutions in place, plus good leadership, and all of that served to limit what McCarthy was able to accomplish.
So by definition, you've just given a couple of the things that America's in crisis: poor leadership and poor influencers. Right now, we have influencers that are doing it over silly stuff in interesting fashion, or something.
We'll also do it for money and are far more effective. I mean, TikTok influencers, that stuff really works.
It does.
You just buy it.
Yeah, and some of it's titillating, some of it's intriguing, and others, a lot of it's just plain dumb and a waste of time, and why important things need to be fixed. Okay, I remain optimistic. Bill, optimistic or pessimistic?
Oh, absolutely. Have to be optimistic.
Okay,
There's no
thank
other
you.
choice.
Okay, thank you. Stephen, you want to correct both of us? We shouldn't be optimistic nor pessimistic. We
as
should
long
be.
as Triumph is still making motorcycles, I'm optimistic.
Oh my gosh, back to your poor money decision making. Okay, fair enough. All right, Professor, great show. Thank you for your conversation today. Hope to see you next Friday, perhaps.
Yep, I think
All
so.
right. I got to move on with the day, so no
Awesome.
after show. Everyone, thank you. Enjoy it. Bill, thank you for your constant participation. Stephen, have a great day.
Thanks,
too.
guys.